Good morning. I'm Peter Alexander in Washington. We are coming on the air at this hour with breaking news. President Biden right now has made a secret, unscheduled visit to Ukraine's capital of Kyiv. The president arriving there within the last few hours, meeting this morning with President Volodymyr Zelenskyy just days before the one-year anniversary of Russia's brutal invasion. These photos taken within the last couple of hours. The high-stakes, high-profile trip in many ways is unprecedented. An American president landing in an active war zone where American troops are not fighting. President Biden had been expected to leave Washington tonight, Monday night, for Poland to thank America's NATO allies and to reiterate America's enduring commitment to Ukraine. I want to get right to my colleague, NBC's chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel. He is there on the ground in Ukraine this morning. Richard, this was a daring but certainly a deliberate decision as we approach this critical anniversary. What more can you tell us about what the two leaders, Zelenskyy and Biden, have been able to do together, including that meeting that we know took place at the presidential palace?
So security in Kyiv, Peter, is extraordinarily tight. There are no cars allowed on the roads. In some places, cell phone service, both for voice and data, has been cut off. This is an extraordinarily unusual visit. As you said, previous American presidents have visited war zones before, but generally those visits took place on an American military base or in a closed environment. Now you have President Biden visiting an active war zone. In fact, during the visit, air raid sirens could be heard in Kyiv, heard all across this country. One of the stops he made was in front of a cathedral that also serves as a memorial to Ukrainians who've lost their lives fighting in this conflict. So an extraordinarily rare visit, but one that comes at an important time in this conflict. Russia has launched a new offensive, and it is the United States' way of showing, President Biden's way of showing personally that he's committed to this story and is willing to put himself at physical risk to express solidarity with Ukraine 1 year into this war.
Richard, certainly over the course of the next few hours and days, we'll get new details about how the White House was able to pull this off to safely get President Biden into the center of this war zone right now. As we're hearing from witnesses on the ground there in Kyiv, they are saying that they have never seen security in the capital city like they are seeing today. As you note, the president was there alongside President Zelenskyy. He was at St. Michael's Church. That's the Golden Dome that so often you see in that live shot, the backdrop that we have shown throughout the course of the last year as this brutal war has gone on. That wall of remembrance just across the way there that President Zelenskyy in the past said represented the price of freedom and independence for the people of that country, the price that they have paid with so many Ukrainians losing their lives. Elena Zelenskyy, President Zelenskyy's wife, they're seen on the left alongside Joe Biden, who appears to be wearing his blue and yellow tie that he has often worn in support of Ukraine. I want to get to Erin McLaughlin, who is on the ground for us in Kyiv. She was able to witness the president during his events there. Erin, you're at the Wall of Remembrance. What did you see?
Yeah, that's right. Just a short while ago, we watched from a distance as President Biden and President Zelenskyy visited the Golden Dome St. Michael's Cathedral behind me. I watched at a distance as they walked out through the courtyard over that way to the Wall of Remembrance, the Wall of Remembrance that has thousands of pictures of fallen Ukrainian soldiers. Just over that way is a wreath that President Biden laid with the flag of the United States. It was a truly historic moment as this visit took place. We did hear an air raid siren, something that has become a common occurrence here in the Capitol. We noted that both President Zelenskyy and President Biden seemed unfazed by the alarm, calmly walking, and then President Biden departed. I witnessed all of this from, as I said, a distance. They cleared this entire area in what was an unprecedented security operation for the Capitol. There were multiple barriers, dogs. We could see snipers overhead. The entire area was cleared of pedestrians. Any journalists standing around were pushed back into a nearby hotel. I was able to witness this from on high, from a window, but even then, Ukrainian military inside that hotel were pushing people back away from the windows, but we managed to take a look. Photography was prohibited. This was a particularly special moment for the Ukrainian people. We heard from the deputy foreign minister prior to confirmation of the visit tell Ukrainian national television, quote, "It is important for us that on the eve of the anniversary of the aggression, we will feel and see not only verbal support, but also the presence of our important main partners in Kyiv." Back to you.
Aaron, I want to stay with you for a second, if I can, really quickly, as you stand there at the Wall of Remembrance and get a better understanding of just the drama of this day. As for hours, there's been speculation among some on social media as they saw an American, it appeared, motorcade, now confirmed an American motorcade, driving through the streets of Kyiv, an air raid siren sounding as the president began this walkabout, as they describe it. There. Can you just take us into that moment and just sort of what this day has been like for you in anticipation of an arrival of some dignitary who we now know is President Biden?
Well, this is a truly historic moment. This is the first time in 15 years that a U.S. president has visited the capital, Kyiv, and during wartime, no less, without ostensibly the presence of the U.S. military to back him. Unprecedented, as I said, security operation that was apparent for everyone in the capital to see. The Twitter, Telegram was abuzz with rumors that the president was, in fact, making this visit. And it is on a particularly historic day. Today marks the 9th anniversary of the killing of the Heavenly 100 here in Ukraine. That is when more than 100 men and women lost their lives challenging the Russian-backed regime in the Maidan Square, triggering, in the eyes of many here in Ukraine, what has been a 9-year ongoing war, their struggle for freedom. To see the President of the United States, to know that he is here in the capital showing his support and solidarity is extremely important. And an extremely important message in the eyes of the people of Ukraine, not only to their country, but also to the entire world.
The United States has said to China, basically, that there will be significant consequences if it does pursue the provision of lethal weapons, of lethal force and aid to the Russians right now. While you were speaking, we just received a note. I got this in my inbox from the White House. It says it's a statement from President Biden on his visit to Kyiv, Ukraine. I want to read it for you quickly as I can, and I hope that in the moments ahead of us, we will have new pictures from the ground of President Biden's arrival there. But it reads in part, as the world prepares to mark the 1-year anniversary of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, I am in Kyiv today to meet with President Zelenskyy and reaffirm our unwavering and unflagging commitment to Ukraine's democracy, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. He adds, when Putin launched his invasion nearly 1 year ago, he thought Ukraine was weak and the West was divided. He thought he could outlast us, but he was dead wrong. The president also details some announcements he will be making in the days and hours ahead. He says that he will announce another delivery of critical equipment, including artillery ammunition, anti-armor systems, and air surveillance radars to help protect the Ukrainian people from aerial bombardments. I'll note that the United States has already provided more than $30 billion in military aid to Ukraine, part of more than $100 billion, $30 billion, I should say, part of $100 billion the U.S. has provided as part of this war effort so far. He says that this week the U.S. will also announce additional sanctions against elites and companies that are trying to evade or backfill Russia's war machine. Over the last year, the U.S. has built a coalition of nations from the Atlantic to the Pacific to help defend Ukraine with unprecedented military, economic, and humanitarian support. I can tell you in my conversations with White House officials over the course of the last several days, we expect to hear from the president on Tuesday when he is in Poland. He will first be meeting with the Polish president, President Duda there, where the president's priorities are threefold. One, to reaffirm America's support for Ukraine, separately to thank the NATO allies, including Poland, and finally to send a clear and direct message to the Russians that this war must come to an end, and an end that comes soon. I want to get back to Aaron McLaughlin, who is on the ground, as we have noted right now for us in Kyiv. Aaron, what's the latest that you're seeing there? At this point, we're trying to sort out exactly how long the president will be in Kyiv today and what other plans are on his schedule.
That's right. It's unclear at this point. We are, however, just hearing from President Zelenskyy on Twitter announcing the visit, saying, quote, "Joseph Biden, welcome to Kyiv. Your visit is an extremely important sign of support for all Ukrainians." I'm also getting some more information about that air raid alarm that went off as President Biden and President Zelenskyy were here at St. Michael's Cathedral. I watched as they calmly, with the air raid siren ringing in the back, as they walked over to the Wall of Remembrance and paid tribute to the thousands of Ukrainian men who died on the battlefield starting in 2014. The true death toll, the Ukrainian death toll of the current conflict there in the east and the south is a state secret. I'm getting more information about that siren, in particular from a Kyiv city official telling me that there are two possibilities. Two things could have triggered that alarm that we heard. One of them being the possibility that there was some sort of aircraft in the area triggering the air raid siren. The other possibility is that a missile could have been fired, but not, he said, in the direction of Kyiv to another region. He says he ruled out that any sort of missile was fired toward the capital, Kyiv. This as the president continues his visit.
Aaron, thank you. And right now we are looking at some video that we were just now receiving. This is of the president's arrival at the presidential palace earlier today, wearing his aviators and a suit and tie, greeted there by Volodymyr Zelenskyy and his wife there, Olena Zelenska. Again, this video taking place over the course of the last several hours. And we're getting more details about what happened inside the presidential palace during their visit here, that the two men entered the presidential palace. And you'll excuse the shaky video. This is raw video that was just shot by the crews on the ground with the president there. That the president, as you saw in some of those pictures we showed earlier, was signing a guest book, reiterating his support to the people of Ukraine, taking this photo opportunity alongside Olena Zelenska and President Zelenskyy as well. And we now know that he was joined by some of his top advisors, including the U.S. National Security Advisor, the President's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, who has been one of the most familiar faces that you have seen throughout the course of this crisis and throughout the course of the president's term, as he is focused on this key foreign policy issue for much of his time in office, even in advance of the invasion, releasing declassified intelligence warning that Russia was preparing to go into Ukraine. President Biden and Volodymyr Zelenskyy also delivering some remarks inside, where the president went second and saying, among other things, it is critical that there not be any doubt, none whatsoever, about United States support. I want to go to NBC's Josh Letterman, my colleague, who is on the ground in Warsaw, Poland, where we thought we would first see President Biden. That's where he was scheduled to be arriving on Tuesday in advance of the historic remarks he was going to be delivering ahead of this anniversary. Josh, tell us about the situation there and what you're hearing about some of America's allies with whom he'll be visiting.
Yeah, that's right, Peter. While in Poland, President Biden will have an opportunity not only to meet with President Duda, but also with the Bucharest Nine, a group of NATO allies that are really on Russia's doorstep about the threat not only to Ukraine, but the broader threat to European security that they feel is posed by Russia's aggression and by its invasion of Ukraine. And that really is the same message that President Biden is trying to send with his visit today to Kyiv. It's not only about U.S. support, with President Biden making the case in that meeting with President Zelenskyy. He said he wants to say, we are here to stay. The U.S. is not leaving. So it's partially about that. But there is also a message about why this is important beyond simply Ukraine, that this is a fight that the president feels that if it's not fought in Ukraine, if we don't help the Ukrainians to defend themselves, that this is a fight the rest of Europe is going to have to face itself, that it threatens America's own national security, and that continued U.S. assistance with not only weapons but with diplomatic and economic support is not charity. It's not helping another country simply for the sake of helping them, but that this is vital for America's own national security interests. That is the way that the president is hoping he will be able to maintain the unity, not only amongst the allies, but frankly, amongst American public and Republicans, some of whom have balked at continued U.S. assistance to Ukraine. There were a group of House Republicans in the newly GOP-controlled House who want to immediately cut off support to Ukraine. Over the weekend, we instead saw some senior Republican leaders say, no, as a party, we are standing firm with Ukraine, and that is what President Biden hopes will really continue to be the case if he is able to make that argument in Kyiv, standing in the Ukrainian capital, where, rewind to a year ago, President Putin was predicting he was going to be able to sweep through the country in a matter of days, overtake the capital, which was an early target for the Russians. And here we are a year later. President Biden is able to go stand calmly in the presidential palace next to Volodymyr Zelenskyy and have this display of unity amongst Ukraine and its allies. And President Biden hoping to continue to make that case as he then travels from Ukraine to here in Poland, where we expect him to spend the next several days, that kind of support is going to continue and, in fact, needs to be even more robust as these allies discuss what next they can do to help Ukraine, whether they are going to provide the type of long-range weapons that Ukraine has been asking, whether they are going to provide the fighter jets that Ukraine has been asking. This has been a continued balancing act as these Western allies try to give Ukraine what they feel Ukraine needs without doing anything that they worry would escalate this into a broader conflict between NATO and a nuclear-armed Russia. But clearly there is a sense as we near this one-year anniversary of the war that support for Ukraine needs only to increase, not to decrease. President Biden making it very clear that from his point of view, the U.S. is not going anywhere. Peter?
Josh Letterman on the ground in Warsaw, Poland. For those of you who are waking up with us right now, we are reporting that President Biden has arrived in Kyiv, Ukraine. He has already visited, as you see there, the presidential palace, seen signing a guest book, visiting with President Zelenskyy as well. Upon his arrival there, where he was greeted by the president and his wife, we're now getting some of the details of their conversation. President Zelenskyy saying to President Biden, thank you for coming. President Biden looking at Zelenskyy and saying, most importantly, how are the children? It's amazing to see you. When greeted by the president, he also added that he was there. The purpose of his visit was to convey to Zelenskyy that the U.S. was, quote, here to stay. As he added, we are not leaving. Richard Engel is on the ground for us in Ukraine right now. Richard, this really, raises a lot of questions. I think a lot of Americans with support for this war beginning to soften, according to recent polls, about what the end goal here is. The president says that he will be here for as long as it takes. But the question for a lot of Americans and even for lawmakers is what the it is there. Is it a timetable? Is it about territory? Is it about spending? What does winning look like? And will the situation be any different 1 year from now ahead of what we anticipate is going to be a very bloody spring offensive?
So, Peter, the Russian forces have already launched their spring offensive. They've launched it early. Both sides, according to sources I'm speaking to, believe that there was an advantage to be gained by striking first. Russia wanted to launch its offensive now, even though it's clearly still freezing cold here and is not ideal conditions for a spring offensive, but wanted to launch it early before new weapons, new tanks, new pieces of artillery, new air defense systems can not only be brought into this country, but also integrated into the other weapon systems that Ukraine already has. But so far, the Russian offensive has not been terribly successful. Russia's losing a lot of troops. It is resorted to using mercenaries, sending them in human waves. And according to Ukrainian officials, and I've spoken to them directly with people involved in following the mercenaries, tens of thousands of mercenaries and Russian troops have been killed just in the last several weeks trying to push the front line forward. So Russia is trying to gain territory, but so far it is struggling in a way that Russia has been struggling from the very beginning to make progress in this war. Ukraine wants to keep moving. They want to take advantage of Russia's inability to advance, that they want to take advantage of the high number of casualties, and they certainly want to take advantage of the political support that they have from President Biden and other Western leaders right now. So they believe that this is a moment to launch their own offensive, potentially knocking a very serious blow to Russian forces. What does victory look like for Ukraine? Pushing Russian troops out of their country. What they're most concerned about is what loss looks like. That if Vladimir Putin is allowed to take a piece of this country and allowed to keep it, Ukrainians are convinced, and American officials are also convinced at the Pentagon and the White House, that if Putin is allowed to take a piece of Ukraine, that he won't stop there, that he will keep going, devour more of this country, and potentially expand the conflict deeper into Europe. Many here in Ukraine will say, we've seen this example before. We saw what happened when strong men are not challenged. We saw it with appeasement in World War II, that unless you draw a line in the sand and fight for it, that dictators, when unchecked, will continue their aggression. So I think this is an opportunity for President Biden to make that message, as he's made several times, that this is not just a war between Russia and Ukraine, largely centered out here in the freezing east, that this is a question of sovereignty. It is a question of the world order, and that the world should not sit by and allow Russia, which launched this attack a year ago, an unprovoked aggression against Ukraine, which hadn't done anything to start this war, and that it should not be left without a firm and long-term response.
And Richard, as you've been speaking, we've been watching President Biden there with his host, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, in the presidential palace, where he was greeting the Ukrainian delegation. Also before that, greeting the American delegation that traveled with the president into Ukraine, including the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, as well as the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Richard, as we anticipate, we're going to hear remarks from President Biden that were delivered only a short time ago. I do want to ask you about what is this growing pressure campaign, including that from a bipartisan group of lawmakers who are really urging President Biden to supply F-16s to Ukraine. I had the opportunity to ask John Kirby, one of the National Security Council spokespeople, on Friday about Abrams tanks that were expected to arrive in the next several months. That is still months away, but there's now a call for aircraft to arrive as well. Is there any likelihood that that happens, if not from the U.S., but from other allies, with some promising they will come?
It's certainly a possibility, and I think it's more likely now than it was several weeks ago. We just saw this Munich Security Conference, which happens every year. This year it was focused on Ukraine, and there was quite a bit of solidarity. I think in the early stages of this war there was not, but I think now we are starting to see the Western allies get together and talk more seriously about providing weapons in large quantities, not just doling it out piece by piece.
Richard, sorry to interrupt you. We are now watching President Zelenskyy seated beside President Biden delivering remarks. Let's take a listen.
And what we have to do to stop the war, to have success in this war, to make Ukraine more stronger, and how to win this year. You're very welcome, Mr. President. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. Presumptuous of me to say this, but I thought it was important that the President of the United States be here the day the attack began. Because as the President remember, I was warning the world that he was going to attack. I was certain of it. And I thought it was critical that there would not be any doubt, none whatsoever, about U.S. support for Ukraine in their war against the brutal attack by Russia. It's good to be back in Kyiv. I was telling the President, one of my newer staff members on the flight from Washington into Poland asked me how many times I've been to Kyiv. And I had to stop and think, it's my 8th trip. and much has changed. Much of it bad with the invasion, but also the Ukrainian people have stepped up in a way that few people ever have in their defense, and have apparently also embraced the notions of democracy. No longer discussions about whether or not certain privileged people have control. And, and I bring greetings and goodwill from your members of Congress, and you had a very good impression, as you know, when you spoke there last. And for all the disagreement we have in our Congress on some issues, there is a significant agreement on support for Ukraine. Because this is so much larger than just Ukraine. It's about freedom and democracy in Europe. It's about freedom and democracy writ large. And all the American people, I know that so many have kept Ukrainian people, particularly women and children, in their prayers. Seeing what's happened, they can't fathom the idea of the shelling night and the shelling of everything from orphanages to schools to the like. It's barbaric. And I'm here to show our unwavering support for the nation's independence, their sovereignty, and territorial integrity. And today, I hope we're going to have a chance to discuss how the United States and our allies, by keeping constant contact with and our partners, can most effectively support you and your cause, Mr. President. And I look forward to discussing all of this and then addressing the world with you afterwards. But again, the admiration for the people of Ukraine, ordinary, hardworking citizens who were never trained to be military. The way they've stepped up, it's beyond heroic. And the whole world is looking. The whole world.
Thank you very much.
We're leaving. We're walking out. We're walking out. Press, we're walking out. We're walking out.
Those were the remarks of President Biden and President Zelenskyy just a short time ago at the presidential palace in Kyiv. The leaders not taking any questions from reporters there. We're learning new information about how this trip came to be. The president was scheduled to depart at 7 p.m. Eastern time tonight, Monday night, to go to Poland instead. We are now learning from those reporters who were traveling with him that he left from Joint Base Andrew just outside of Washington, D.C., at 4:15 in the morning on Sunday morning. Here are more of the remarks of the two leaders. I want to be clear, are we going to listen to these gentlemen?
Пане президенте, шановні пані та панове, журналісти, шановні присутні, шановна
Well, we listened to
команда
President
президента.
Zelenskyy, clearly speaking in Ukrainian. I want to get to Richard Engel again on the ground right now. The president, as we saw Richard in his remarks, making it very clear that his visit was to make it clear that there should not be any doubt, none whatsoever, about U.S. support for Ukraine in the war. Does this change the equation in any form? Some of the recent headlines obviously have really seemed to escalate the situation, most notably Antony Blinken speaking on Meet the Press on this channel, on this network, just within the last 24 hours, basically warning that China was considering providing lethal aid to Russia right now, which would potentially only expand this situation. Richard?
So there does seem to be a sense that the Ukrainians have a bit of momentum with them, that they have the wind at their backs, even though it is the Russians who have launched this second offensive. The second offensive that the Russians have launched is going poorly. The big question out there is, will China now step in, which has backed Putin politically, but not very much so militarily? President
Zelenskyy, now we have the translation. Let's take a listen.
Remember the focus, the attention, the attitude of President Biden and the United States to every single Ukrainian, to Ukraine. We remain constantly in communication with the President of the United States over the course of this large-scale war. And this is the first visit over 15 years. and this is really the most important visit or the whole history of Ukraine-US relationship. This is the visit in this most difficult period for Ukraine, when Ukraine is fighting for our own liberty, for the liberties of the world, and this underlines the results that we have already achieved and what sort of historic achievements we might gain all together with the whole world, with the United States, with Europe. And today our negotiations were very fruitful. They were very important and crucial, and as has become traditional in relationship between our countries, I would like to extend words of gratitude personally to Mr. President Biden and to his team, to the Congress, to all the US people, and I thank you for this level of Ukraine-US cooperation. And this week will be marking 1 year of our fight against Russia's aggression. So it's very symbolic that we solidify our resilience through 2 meetings with the President of Ukraine, my visit in December and the visit of the Mr. President of the United States to Kiev today. The results of this visit will surely be seen and will surely have a reflection on the battlefield and in liberating our territories. The decision of the United States on Abrams tanks for Ukraine has already presented a foundation for establishing a tank coalition, and it's of historic importance in many other aspects, more specifically in air defense, in Patriots, for the defense of our cities. Now, this is a very fundamental and crucial reinforcement of our capacities. We've also talked about long-range weapons and the weapons that may still be supplied to Ukraine, even though it wasn't supplied before. I know, Mr. President, that there will be a very significant package of security support to Ukraine, and currently it will serve as a clear signal that Russia's attempts of revanche will have no chance, and that we will together defend our cities and citizens from Russia's terror, will have more impetus towards our victory. And today we have yet again underlined that we have our common vision with regards to the perspectives of this war. We have coordinated the follow-on pressure on the terrorist state. We are working hard on the reinforcement of sanctions, both bilaterally and in the form of G7, which is very important. We have common vision on the contents of many aspects of our peace formula, because it's security elements as well as the tasks to restore the UN Charter to its full capacity and to defend the international rule-based order. That's a common, a joint task for all the countries that are interested in the international security. The rebuilding and the recovery of justice is also very important for all those who was affected by the Russian terror, by the Russian war, and the aggressor has to take responsibility for the aggression and to reimburse all the damages. I thank to the President of the United States for supporting our work on restoring the justice, more specifically in the work of all of our institutions in that area, and we believe there's no alternatives to the establishment of the special tribunal. This is the position of of Ukraine, and we shall support this position. And I would really like the United States to be engaged in the implementation of our peace formula, because its implementation would mean a reinforcement of global stability and the predictability of international relations. And we have some achievements in this area already this week in New York, together with the United States of America. And over 60 other countries will be submitting for the consideration of the UN General Assembly of the draft resolution on supporting peace in Ukraine. And on the eve of the 24th of February, we believe that the approval of this resolution would be very significant evidence to the fact that the terrorist state would never break a civilized country. And I think we are also opening a special tablet dedicated to the President Biden. The first call at the night of the 24th of February took place with the United States, and since that time we had conversations, and there was very significant attention to RFI, to the protection of Ukraine's democracy. Besides, there's the personal contribution in President Biden in solidifying the liberty and democracy in the world. This will be remembered eternally, and Ukraine is grateful to you, Mr. President, to all the U.S. citizens, to all those who cherish freedom just as we cherish them. Glory to our warriors, glory to our allies, and glory to Ukraine.
Of the United States of America.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. You know, it was 1 year ago this week that we spoke on the telephone, Mr. President. It was very late at night in Washington, very early in the morning here in Kyiv. Russian planes were in the air and tanks were rolling across your border. You told me that you could hear the explosions in the background. I'll never forget that. And the world was about to change. I remember it vividly, because I asked you next, I asked you, what is there, Mr. President? What can I do for you? How can I be of help? And I don't know if you remember what you said to me, but you said, and I quote, "Gather the leaders of the world, ask them to support Ukraine." Gather the leaders of the world and ask them to support Ukraine. And you said that you didn't know when we'd be able to speak again. That dark night, 1 year ago, the world was literally at the time bracing for the fall of Kyiv. Seems like a lot longer ago than a year, but think back to that year. Perhaps even the end of Ukraine. You know, 1 year later, Kyiv stands, and Ukraine stands. Democracy stands. The Americans stand with you, and the world stands with you. Kyiv has captured a part of my heart, I must say. I've come here 6 times as vice president, once as president, and in 2009 as vice president when I first came here. Then back in 2014, I came 3 times in the aftermath of the Revolution of Dignity. And I again came in 2015 to address the Rada about the work of building a strong democracy. And I came in 2017, just before I left office as vice president. I knew I'd be back, but I wanted to be sure. Even though the election were over, Barack and I were out of office, I decided to make one more trip before the next president was sworn in to Kyiv. So President Zelenskyy, you deeply honor me here in Kyiv with you today. To meet with your military, your intelligence folks, your diplomatic teams, community leaders who have stepped up and helped their country in their hour of need. It's astounding who stood up. Everybody. Everybody. Women, young children, trying to do something, just trying to do something. Pulling people out of apartments and being shelled and literally what I think is war crimes. It's astounding. And the whole world sees it and looks at it. This is the largest land war in Europe in 3/4 of a century. and you're succeeding against all and every expectation except your own. We have every confidence that you're going to continue to prevail. You know, from the moment I first received an intelligence report in the fall, about a year ago, we were focused on determining how do we rally the rest of the world. How do I help you with the promise you asked me to make, to rally the world? Well, how do you succeed? How do you get a world to respond to a prosperous economy, a confident democracy, a secure and independent state? When United Americans of all political backgrounds decided that they would step up. American people know it matters. Unchecked aggression is a threat to all of us. We built a coalition of nations from the Atlantic to the Pacific, NATO in the Atlantic, Japan in the Pacific, I mean, across the world. The number of nations stood up over 50. Help Ukraine defend itself with unprecedented military, economic, and humanitarian support. We united the leading economies of the world to impose unprecedented costs that are squeezing Russia's economic lifelines. Together, we've committed nearly 700 tanks and thousands of armored vehicles, 1,000 artillery systems, more than 2 million rounds of artillery ammunition, more than 50 advanced launch rocket systems, anti-ship and air defense systems, all defend Ukraine, and that doesn't count the other $500 million we're announcing with you today and tomorrow. That's going to be coming your way. And that's just the United States in this piece. And just today, that announcement includes artillery ammunition for HIMARS and howitzers, more javelins, anti-armor systems, air surveillance radars to help protect Ukrainian people from aerial bombardments. Later this week, we will announce additional sanctions against elites and companies that are trying to evade sanctions and backfill Russia's war machine. And thanks to bipartisan support in Congress, this week we're delivering billions in direct budgetary support, which the government can put to use immediately and help provide for basic services of citizens. The cost that Ukraine has had to bear has been extraordinarily high, and the sacrifices have been far too great. They've been met, but they've been far too great. We mourn alongside the families of those who've been lost to the brutal and unjust war. We know that there'll be very difficult days and weeks and years ahead. But Russia's aim was to wipe Ukraine off the map. Putin's war of conquest is failing. Russia's military has lost half its territory it once occupied. Young, talented Russians are fleeing by the tens of thousands, not wanting to come back to Russia. Not just fleeing from the military, fleeing from Russia itself, because they see no future in their country. Russia's economy is now a backwater, isolated and struggling. Putin thought Ukraine was weak and the West was divided. As you know, Mr. President, I said to you in the beginning, he's counting on us not sticking together. He was counting on the inability to keep NATO united. He was counting on us not to be able to bring in others on the side of Ukraine. He thought he could outlast us. I don't think he's thinking that right now. God knows what he's thinking, but I don't think he's thinking that. But he's just been plain wrong. Plain wrong. And 1 year later, The evidence is right here in this room. We stand here together. Mr. President, I'm delighted to be able to repay your visit to our country. In Washington, not long ago, you told the Congress, quote, "We have no fear, nor should anyone in the world have it," end of quote. You and all Ukrainians, Mr. President, remind the world every single day what the meaning of the word courage is. From all sectors of your economy, all walks of all life. It's astounding. Astounding. You remind us that freedom is priceless. It's worth fighting for as long as it takes, and that's how long we're going to be with you, Mr. President, for as long as it takes.
We'll do it.
Thank you.
President Biden and President Zelenskyy of Ukraine at the presidential palace only a short time ago. Their remarks there, the president recalling the fears that Kyiv, that Ukraine would fall into Russia's hands a year ago when the invasion began. The president saying 1 year later, Kyiv stands, Ukraine stands, democracy stands. And he said, the Americans stand with you, and the world stands with you. Richard Engel is on the ground for us in Ukraine this morning. And Richard, again, just to punctuate the sort of daring nature of this trip by an American president into an active war zone where missiles have been landing regularly, including in the capital city of Kyiv.
So this is an extraordinary visit. Other world leaders have come to Kyiv over the last several months, but not an American president, not the president who is personally so committed to this war. The United States is by far the main supplier of weapons and financial support to Ukraine. So this is different than to have the British Prime Minister or the Italian leadership coming. This is a significant step. And American presidents have gone to war zones in the past, but generally when they went to Iraq or Afghanistan, they were going to places that had a large U.S. military presence, often just staying on military bases. That didn't happen today. Instead, President Biden came into Kyiv amid great secrecy, a tremendous amount of security, telephones disrupted, traffic not allowed on the streets because of the dangerous nature of this kind of visit. But he wanted to do it to show support at this critical time. And a year ago in Kyiv, the city was bracing for a possible fall. I was in Kyiv in those early days of the war, and it did seem like perhaps Russian troops were going to drive their way into the city and topple the government and take the country. But instead, we don't have Vladimir Putin in Kyiv right now, and that could have happened had the Russians taken over the country. You could have had the Russian president there declaring victory, standing like a conquering general in the capital. Instead, we have Russia launching a new offensive, trying to do what it failed to do a year ago, and we have the U.S. president in Kyiv expressing admiration for the Ukrainian solidarity and their courage, and expressing continued American support.
Richard Engel on the ground for us in Ukraine. Richard, we hope that you'll continue to be safe. We're always grateful for your views from the ground. That's going to conclude this NBC News special report. We will have much more coming up this morning on this NBC channel. On the Today Show, I'm Peter Alexander. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.